Hello everyone, it's the Book Traveller, and I'm just wondering if you can have a guess as to where I am now. You might be able to get a few clues from the view outside my hotel window today. Not least the weather is very famous part of this place. I'll narrow it down for you. I am in England, United Kingdom, and this is a northern city. There are some other clues in this picture here, but give you a couple of seconds to think about it. Then I'm going to give you a very big clue as to where I am. So, any ideas? Let me show you. I am in Manchester, which is really great to be here. I'm from not far from here myself, just to the south of Manchester, but I've got to spend the night here. The view is not the best one out of here, but there is a very couple of landmarks which we can point out here. So this little tower over here, it's actually not such a little tower, but that is a very famous prison called Strangeways Prison. More commonly known these days as His Majesty's Prison, Manchester. But because it was built in 1868 in an area called Strangeways, it's more commonly referred to as Strangeways Prison. It's housed all sorts of nasty criminals over the years, still does. Category A and B prison with some nasty individuals in there. It's been famous for riots and all sorts over the years. Down beneath me, down here, is also a very famous train station, Victoria Station. If I just pop the camera up over the top, you can see a very elaborate clock on the corner of the building, and the main train station is under that big bubble over there now, which is not just used for trains but more modern day trams as well now, electric trams, which is rejuvenated this city fantastically. And Manchester famous for lots of other things, sporting teams. Manchester United, I'm sure you may have heard of. Manchester City, its rival football team. Lots of other sports represented as well. Cricket is Lancashire Cricket Ground, and also Manchester's music scene, which has been world famous through the years. I'm going to sit down so you can talk to me better. And one of the more famous Manchester bands of recent years, you may have heard of Oasis with the Gallagher brothers. They are currently on a reuniting tour and are actually playing in Manchester tonight. So if we were to draw a line from me past the Victoria train station across towards Strangeways Prison, and about 2 miles beyond that, there is a park called Heaton Park, and Oasis are playing live there tonight. So I don't think I'll see much of it, but I might see some lights, hoping so later on this evening as well. I would love to have gone to get some tickets there, but they were so expensive. It's ridiculous. Anyway, here we are. I thought I'd sport my Manchester t-shirt for you, and I thought it's an appropriate place so we can sit and read, hopefully, the final few chapters of The Wager. We're in part 5 of the book. We've read a couple of chapters of that already. We're up to chapter 23, which is called Grub Street Hacks. So I'll get comfortable. You look at Manchester out the back, and more likely the weather. The rain, it's always raining in Manchester. And the view from here is actually to the north of Manchester itself, up to the hills towards Bury and Burnley and Rochdale. So let's get on with Grub Street Hacks, chapter 23, The Wager. 5.5 years. That's how long the three men had been gone from England, presumed dead. They had been mourned, and yet here they were, like three Lazaruses. They began to unspool details of what had happened, days after they had returned to Wager Island following their failed attempt to leave, and after they had buried their murdered companion. A small party of native Patagonians had appeared in 2 canoes. At that time, Cheap, Byron, and Hamilton were stranded with 10 other castaways, including Midshipman Campbell and the surgeon Elliot. A Patagonian man approached them and addressed them in Spanish, which Elliot could understand. The man said that his name was Martin, and that he was a member of the seafaring people known as the Chono. They lived farther north than the Kawascar people, who had visited earlier. Martin indicated that he'd been to Chiloe Island, the site of the nearest Spanish settlement, and the castaways beseeched him to help them navigate their one remaining boat, the barge, there. In exchange, they'd given him the barge when they arrived. Martin agreed, and on March 6, 1742, they set out, along with the other Chono hugging the coast as they rowed northward. Soon afterward, while many in the party were reaching for food along the shore, 6 of the castaways absconded with the barge, never to be heard from again. What could provoke the villains so foul a deed I cannot tell, except it was their cowardice, Cheap recalled in his account. Midshipman Campbell, however, had overheard the deserters whispering about their desire to be free of their monomaniacal captain. The Chono continued piloting the group across the Golfo de Penas towards Chiloé Island. Without the barge, they proceeded in the Chono's canoes, stopping periodically to gather food on shore. During the journey, a castaway died, leaving only 5 poor souls. As one of them put it, Cheap, Byron, Campbell, Hamilton, and Elliot. Byron had always thought that Elliot would be the most likely among them to survive, but this once indomitable man was growing weaker and weaker until he laid down on a barren stretch of shoreline. His body was shriveled to the bone and his voice was fading. He fumbled for his one valuable possession, his pocket watch, and offered it to Campbell. Then Campbell noted he departed his miserable life. Byron, lamenting how they scraped a hole for him in the sand, seemed burdened by the arbitrary nature of their fates. Why had so many of his companions died, and why should he live? As the 4 castaways continued across the gulf, they followed their Chono guides' advice about when to row and when to rest, and how to find shelter and limpets. Even so, the castaways' accounts betrayed their inherent racism. Byron routinely referred to the Patagonians as savages, and Campbell complained, "We durst not find the least fault with their conduct, they looking upon themselves as our masters, and we finding ourselves obliged to submit them to all things." But the castaways' feelings of superiority were upended daily. When Byron plucked some berries to eat, one of the Chono snatched them from his hand, indicating that they were poisonous. Thus, in all probability, did these people now save my life, Byron wrote. After travelling some 70 miles, the castaways could see to the northwest the cape of the Gulf they had previously failed to round. To their surprise, their guides didn't lead them in direction. Instead, they heeled the canoes on land and proceeded to break the boats apart, each one separating into 5 distinct components, which made them easier to transport. Everyone was given a piece to lug, except for Cheap. Without any more dreams to sustain him, he seemed to be disintegrating not only physically but mentally. Hoarding his small bits of food and muttering to himself, he required help walking the moment the trek started. The castaways followed Martin and his party overland along a secret path, an 8-mile portage route through the wilderness, which allowed them to avoid the perilous seas around the cape. They trudged through a swamp with their knees and sometimes their waists submerged. Byron realized that the theft of the barge had made things easier. There was no way they could have dragged it overland. Even without it, Byron grew exhausted, and after a few miles he collapsed under a tree, where, as he put it, gave way to the melancholy reflections. He'd seen others finally give in to the tempting prospect of dissolving into another world. At least it would require no more labour to get there, but Byron forced himself to stand. These reflections would answer no end. At the end of the portage, the Chono reassembled the canoes and launched them into the channel that wound between the fractured islands off Chile. For weeks the party edged northward, rowing from channel to channel, fjord to fjord, until one day, in June 1742, the castaways glimpsed a headland in the distance. It was, Martin announced, Chiloé Island. To get there they still had to cross half a gulf that opened onto the unobstructed Pacific, and that was so perilous that it had served as a natural barrier to the Spanish incursions farther south. There ran a most dreadful hollow sea, dangerous indeed for any open boat. Byron noted, but 1,000 times more for their tiny canoes. Hamilton decided to wait several days with one of the Chono before daring an attempt, but the other 3 castaways set out in a canoe with Martin, who constructed a small sail from its bits of blankets to propel them. It began to snow and the boat sprung a leak. Byron frantically bailed while Cheap mumbled into the wind. They pressed on through the night, the boat teetering. But as the sun rose, the castaways made it across the passage and touched the southern tip of Chiloé. It had been 3 months since they had departed Wager Island, and nearly a year since they had been shipwrecked. As Byron wrote, he and the other castaways with him had hardly appeared the figures of men. Cheap was in the gravest condition. I could compare his body to nothing but an ant-hill, with thousands of those insects crawling over it. Byron noted he was now past past attempting to rid himself in the least from this torment, as he had quite lost himself, not recollecting our names that were about him, or even his own. His beard was as long as a hermit's, his legs were as big as millposts, though his body appeared nothing but skin and bone. The men trudged several miles through heavy snow to an indigenous village, where the inhabitants provided them with food and shelter. They made a bed of sheepskins close to the fire for Captain Cheap and laid him upon it, Byron wrote, and indeed it had not been for the kind assistance he had now met with, he could not have survived. Though Byron and Campbell had grown weary of Cheap's tempestuous leadership, they clung to the notion that the captain's original plan might have succeeded had Bulkeley and his party not abandoned them. There had been no Spanish armada lurking off Chiloe, and perhaps they could have crept into a harbour undetected and seized a defenceless trading vessel, doing considerable service to our country, as Campbell put it. Or perhaps this was a fantasy that simply made it easier to live with the choices they had made. Hamilton soon joined the party. One night after they had begun to recover, even Cheap had rebounded some. They feasted on fresh meat and drank liquor brewed from barley. We all made merry, Campbell wrote, adding, we thought ourselves once more in the land of the living. Byron, who had 2 birthdays since leaving England, was now 18. In a few days they set out for another village. As they made their way, a phalanx of Spanish soldiers suddenly descended upon them. After enduring tempests, scurvy, shipwreck, abandonment, and starvation, the castaways were now captives. I was now reduced to the infamous necessity of surrendering myself, Cheap noted, which he called the greatest misfortune that could befall a man. When he was initially handed a document acknowledging his submission to the Spanish crown and told to sign it in exchange for food, he indignantly tossed it to the ground, saying, the officers of the King of England could die of hunger, but they disdained to beg. Yet it didn't matter that he would not sign it. There was no way out, and Cheap and the others were eventually transported in a ship to Valparaiso, a city on the Chilean mainland. They were thrown into what was called the condemned hole, which was so dark that they were unable to see one another's faces. There was nothing but 4 bare walls, Byron wrote, and a swarm of fleas. As people from the region came to catch a glimpse of the prized prisoners, the guards would take them out of the hole and parade them about like circus animals. The soldiers made a pretty penny as they took money from every single person for the sight, Byron noted. 7 months after the 4 men were apprehended, they were moved again, this time to Santiago, where they met with the governor. He considered them prisoners of war, but also gentlemen, and he treated them kindlier. He granted them parole, and as long as they did not try to communicate with anyone in England, they were allowed to live outside the prison. One evening they were invited to dine with Don Jose Pizarro, the Spanish admiral who had chased Anson's squadron for months after its departure from England. Pizarro's armada, in turned out, had tried to round Cape Horn ahead of the British ships, hoping to intercept them in the Pacific, but it too had been almost completely wiped out by storms. One warship with 500 men had vanished. Another with 700 had sunk. Because of the delays from the weather, the 3 remaining warships had run out of food. Sailors had started catching rats and selling them to one another for $4 apiece. Most of the seamen had eventually starved to death, and Pizarro, after snuffing out a mutiny and executing 3 of the conspirators, had ordered a few of his surviving men to turn back. It was hard to say whether Anson's or Pizarro's fleet had suffered the more devastating loss. Though Cheap and the others were no longer imprisoned, they couldn't leave Chile, and their lives moved glacially. Every day here seems to be an age, Cheap lamented. Finally, 2.5 years after they had been captured, they were told that they could go home, although the War of Jenkins' Ear was never formally resolved. Major offensives between Britain and Spain had ceased, and the countries had reached an agreement to exchange any prisoners. Cheap embarked on a ship with Byron and Hamilton, whom he referred to as my 2 faithful companions and fellow sufferers. Campbell, however, was left behind. After so many years in captivity, he had grown close to his Spanish captors, and Cheap accused him of having converted to Catholicism and shifted his allegiance from England to Spain. If true, members of the Wages Company had now perpetrated virtually every grave sin under the Articles of War, including treason. As Cheap, Byron, and Hamilton made their way back home, they sailed past Wager Island and around Cape Horn, as if they were journeying through their ravaged past. Yet, in the everlasting mystery of the sea, this time the passage was relatively calm. When they reached Dover, Byron immediately set out for London on a loaned horse. Now 22, he was dressed like a pauper, and with no spare change he sped past the toll gates. He later recalled that he had been obliged to defraud by riding as hard as I could through them all, not paying the least regard to the men who called out to stop me. Clattering along the muddy cobblestone roads, he raced through fields and hamlets, through suburbs spreading outwards from London, the largest city in Europe with a population approaching 700,000. The city, that great and monstrous thing Defoe called it, had grown even in the years since Byron had been gone. The old houses and churches and shops now crowded amid new brick buildings and tenements and stores. The streets were jammed with coaches and carriages, with noblemen and traders and shopkeepers. London was the pulsing heart of an island empire built on the toll of seamen and slavery and colonialism. Byron reached Great Marlborough Street in a fashionable area in central London. He went to an address where a few of his closest friends had lived. The place was boarded up. Having been absent so many years, and in all that time never having heard a word from home, I knew not who was dead or who was living or where to go next, Byron wrote. He stopped at a dry goods shop that his family used to frequent and inquired about his siblings. He was informed that his sister, Isabella, had gotten married to a lord who was living nearby in Soho Square, an aristocratic neighbourhood with large stone houses built around a bucolic garden. Byron walked there as quickly as he could and knocked on the door of his sister's house, but the porter looked askance at the alien figure. Byron prevailed upon the man to let him inside where Isabella was standing, a thin, elegant woman who later wrote a book on etiquette. She looked bewilderedly at her visitor, then realized it was none other than her dead brother. With that surprise and joy my sister received me, he wrote. The 16-year-old boy she had last seen was now a hardened seaman. David Cheap made his way to London as well. He was nearly 50, and during his long time in captivity he had seemingly kept revisiting every disastrous incident, every cruel snub. Now he discovered that John Bulkeley had accused him, in a book no less, of being an incompetent and murderous commander, a charge that could end not only his military career but his life. Cheap, in a letter to an Admiralty official, decried Bulkeley and his associates as liars. For what can be expected of such poltroons, after most humanely abandoning us and destroying at their departure everything they thought could be of any use to us? Cheap burned to tell his own version, but he wouldn't play Bulkeley's game and publish a book. Instead, he would save his testimony and fury for a forum more determinative, a court-martial composed of a panel of judges, all of them commanding officers like him. He prepared a sworn deposition detailing his allegations, and in a letter to the Secretary of the Admiralty, he insisted that once the judicial hearing was complete, I flatter myself that my conduct will appear unblameable both before and after our shipwreck. In one of his few public comments he remarked, I have nothing to say for nor against the villains until the day of trial, when he added, there would be nothing to stop these men from hanging. The story or stories of the expedition continued to capture the public imagination. The press had grown exceptionally fueled by the loosening of government censorship and by wider literacy. And to satisfy the public's insatiable thirst for news, there had emerged a professional class of scribblers who earned a living from sales rather than from aristocratic patronage, and whom the old literary establishment derided as Grub Street hacks. Grub Street had been part of a poor area in London with doss houses and brothels and fly-by-night publishing ventures. And Grub Street, sniffing a good story, now seized on the so-called affair of the wager. The Caledonian Mercury reported that Bulkeley and the mutinous crew had physically attacked not only Cheap and Hamilton, but also their entire faction, bound them hand and foot before leaving them to the disposal of more merciful barbarians. Another story offered Hamilton's view that Cheap's behaviour was often mysterious and always arrogant and high. Looking back now, though it was clear to Hamilton that the captain had always acted under the guidance of a sagacious foresight. Once the broadsheet newspapers and periodicals were filled with breathless reports, book publishers competed to release first-hand accounts from the other castaways. Shortly after Cheap returned to England, Campbell arrived in another vessel from Chile. He published his own narrative exceeding 100 pages, called The Sequel to Bulkeley and Cummins' Voyage to the South Seas, in which he defended himself from allegations of treason, but soon after he fled the country and joined the Spanish military. John Byron believed that Bulkeley had tried to justify what could not be considered in any other light than that of direct mutiny, and though Byron might have released his own version, he seemed reluctant to speak poorly of his superior officers and indulge in what he called egotism. Meanwhile, other accounts proliferated, one book let by a Grub Street hack, an affecting narrative of the unfortunate voyage and catastrophe of His Majesty's ship Wager, noted that it had been compiled from authentic journals and transmitted by letter to a merchant in London from a person who was an eyewitness of the all affair. However, as a scholar, Philip Edwards, had pointed out, the account is a perverse rehashing, sometimes word for word, of Bulkeley's journey, in which every detail is spun to support Cheap's perspective and uphold the long-standing systems of authority. In a war of words, the gunner's journal had been refashioned into a weapon against him. Because of the sheer number of accounts, including those of dubious provenance, perceptions of the Wager affair varied from reader to reader. Bulkeley, whose journal kept being pilfered by the hacks, was incensed when he realised that it was increasingly being regarded with suspicion, as if, too, might be fake. Within days of Cheap's return to England, the Admiralty issued a summons, publicised in newspapers, for all the Wager's surviving officers, petty officers and seamen to appear in Portsmouth for a court-martial. The trial, to commence in just a few weeks, would have to pierce through the fog of narratives, the contradictory, the shaded, even the fictitious, to discern what had really happened and thus mete out justice. As the writer Janet Malcolm once observed, the law is the guardian of the ideal unmediated truth, truth stripped bare of the ornament of narration. The story that can best withstand the attrition of the rules of evidence is the story that wins. Yet, no matter which story prevailed, the trial would surely expose how the officers and seamen, part of that vanguard of the British Empire, had descended into anarchy and savagery. The sad spectacle might even supplant the glorious tale of Anson's capturing the galleon. Chapter 24. The Docket. After Bulkeley had read in the newspaper about the court-martial summons, he was informed by an attorney that the Admiralty had issued a warrant for his detention. At the time, Bulkeley was in London, and he went to find the marshal who was looking for him. When he tracked down Bulkeley, he pretended to be a relative of one of the castaways who had made the journey in the longboat to Brazil. He inquired what should happen to these men now that Captain Jeep had returned. Hanged, the marshal replied. For God's sake, for what? Bulkeley cried. For not being drowned? And is a murderer at last come home to be their accuser? Sir, they have been guilty of such things to Captain Cheap whilst a prisoner that I believe the gunner and carpenter will be hanged if nobody else. Bulkeley finally admitted that he was the unfortunate gunner of the Wager. The marshal, stunned, said that he had no choice but to take him into custody. Bulkeley was confined until several other officers from the Wager had been rounded up, among them Lieutenant Baines, the carpenter, Cummins, and the boatswain, King. Then they were all transported to Portsmouth. The marshal warned to take particular care that the gunner and carpenter did not make their escape. At the harbour, a transport boat rowed them out to HMS Prince George, a 90-gun man-of-war anchored beyond the harbour. They were sequestered there on board, imprisoned once more by the sea. Bulkeley complained that he was not allowed to receive letters from family or friends. Byron was also summoned, as were other members of the crew. Cheap boarded the ship on his own volition, but likely had to surrender his sword. He had been suffering from gout and respiratory issues since the expedition, but he had gained some of his formidable presence with his elegant officer's waistcoat and severe eyes and taut lips. It was the first time that these men had been together since the island. Now each of them would have to, as Bulkeley said, give accounts of his actions and let justice take place. 18th century British naval law has a reputation for being draconian, but it was often more flexible and forgiving in reality. Under the Articles of War, many transgressions, including falling asleep on watch, were punishable by death. Yet there was usually an important caveat: a court could hand down a lesser sentence if it saw fit, and although overthrowing a captain was a grave crime, mutinous behaviour often applied to minor insubordinations not deemed worthy of severe punishment. Nevertheless, the case against all of the men of the Wager seemed overwhelming. They were not accused of negligible misconduct, but rather of a complete breakdown of naval order, from the highest levels of command to the rank and file, and though they had each tried to shape their stories in ways that justified their actions, the legal system was designed to strip these narratives down to the bare, hard, unemotive facts. In Lord Jim, Joseph Conrad rights of an official naval inquiry. They wanted facts. Facts. They demanded facts, and all of the former castaways' accounts contained at their core certain incontrovertible facts. Neither side disputed that Bulkeley, Baines, and their party had tied up their captain and left him on the island, or that Cheap had shot an unarmed man without any legal proceedings, or even any warning. These were the facts. Bulkeley and his party appeared to have violated the most statutes of the Article of War, Article 19, which barred mutinous assemblies upon any pretence whatsoever upon pain of death. Article 20, which said that no one shall conceal any traitorous or mutinous practices, designs, or words. Article 21, which forbade quarrelling or striking a superior officer, and Article 17, which decreed that any seaman who runs away shall be punished with death. A stringent prosecutor could tack on more charges, including cowardice for defying Cheap's orders to pursue their Spanish enemies and come to the aid of Anson, theft for taking transport boats and other supplies, and even scandalous actions in derogation of God's honour and corruption of good manners. Moreover, Cheap had accused Bulkeley and his party not just of a full-fledged mutiny, but also of attempted murder because they had abandoned him and his followers on the island. Yet Cheap himself would surely face the most damning charge of all, homicide. It was one of the few statutes that offered no leniency for violators. Article 28 stated unequivocally, all murders and wilful killing of any person in the ship shall be punished with death. Even Byron could not rest easy. He himself had briefly mutinied when he initially deserted Cheap on the island and went off with Bulkeley and his party. He had turned back. Was that enough? Although many of the defendants had written accounts in attempts to clear their names, they were rife with glaring omissions. Cheap's report never explicitly acknowledged that the shooting of Cousins. It merely noted that their altercation had led to extremities. Bulkeley's journal described his abandonment of Cheap on the island as if he had been dutifully complying with his captain's wishes. Even worse, many of the legalistic documents produced by the defendants during the expedition indicated a consciousness of guilt. These men knew the rules and regulations, knew exactly what they were doing, and after each violation had tried to create a paper trail to help them escape the consequences. A naval court-martial was intended to do more than adjudicate the innocence or guilt of those on trial. It was meant to uphold and reinforce discipline throughout the service. As one expert put it, the system was contrived to convey the majesty and strength of the state, and to ensure that the few who were guilty of serious crimes would serve as examples. The underlying theory was that simple mariners, having witnessed these spectacles, would be left trembling at the prospect that such tremendous force, the power of life and death, might one day be used against them in the event that they had violated the law. After the famous mutiny on HMS Bounty in 1789, the Admiralty dispatched a ship all the way to the Pacific to hunt down the suspects and bring them to justice in England. Following a court-martial, 3 were sentenced to die. On a ship moored in Portsmouth, they were led up to the forecastle where 3 nooses dangled neck-high from a yardarm. The crew of the ship stood on deck, looking on solemnly. A yellow flag was hoisted, the signal of death. And other vessels in the harbour assembled around the ship. Their companies were obliged to watch too. Crowds of spectators, including children, observed from the shore. After the condemned men prayed, they were asked if they had any last words. One of them was reported by a witness to have said, "Brother seaman, you see before you 3 lusty young fellows about to suffer a shameful death for the dreadful crime of mutiny and desertion. Take warning by our example never to desert your officers, and should they behave ill of you, remember it is not their cause, it is the cause of your country you are bound to support." Each mutineer had a bag placed over his head. A plaited noose was then looped around his neck, and shortly before noon, at the sound of a gun, several crewmen began to pull the ropes, lifting the mutineers high above the sea. The nooses tightened, the men strained for air, and their legs and arms convulsed until they suffocated. Their bodies were left to swing for 2 hours. One Sunday, while the men from the Wager were still waiting on the Prince George for the trial to commence, they attended a religious service on deck. The chaplain noted that a man who goes to sea often descends into the troubled depths where his soul is melted, and he warned the rattled congregants that they should not hold on to vain notions or expectations of a reprieve or pardon. the survivors of the wager had every reason to expect to be hanged, or as Bulkeley put it, fall by the violence of power. So that's the end of chapter 24. Coming up is chapter 25. I think we're into the last couple of chapters of the book, actually. Chapter 25 is called The Court Martial, but I shall read that in a separate edition to be uploaded to the site. So I hope you're enjoying the reading of this book. There is one other on the site as well to read, The Sanctuary. Have a listen to me with that on my travels. There's more books to come as well. So please do hit that subscribe button and join and find out when there's a new download to the YouTube, and hopefully you can follow me through a few more books. So if you haven't already, hit subscribe now. Thanks very much, and see you very shortly for another reading with chapter 25.